work for, we are now recording. For anyone who didn't hear that before, we're going to be recording today and then sharing the presentation with everyone once we have the recording ready. So I am Meredith Seltzer with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in the Bureau of Forestry. And I am here today with Anna Johnson of Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. And I'm just going to go ahead and give a quick overview of what the topic is that we're talking about today, and then introduce Anna a bit, and then I'm going to just send it over to her to give everybody all the good details of this work. So just a little overview first. In 2018, DCNR developed a climate change adaptation and mitigation plan with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And in that plan, among a lot of the actions that are in there is a recommendation to reduce habitat fragmentation by creating migration corridors for plants and wildlife, and then also by prioritizing habitat connectivity in our land protection strategies. So DCNR then contracted the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, which is part of the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program, to start addressing those recommendations. And over the past 2 years, Jeff Wagner, David Yaney, Chris Tracy, Molly Moore, and Anna Johnson of Western Pennsylvania Conservancy created the data set that we're going to talk about today, which identifies highest priority natural lands for maintaining climate change connectivity in Pennsylvania. So Anna is our speaker today, and she is a planning coordinator with Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. She's going to give us an overview of the project and then share some case studies that she's prepared as story maps. Anna has been with WPC in the Pittsburgh office, as she alluded to earlier, for 4 years. She's been working on landscape scale conservation planning projects using GIS analyses for her position. And she also recently presented this data set that we're going to talk about at with DCNR at the We Conserve PA conference. So some of you may have been at that presentation. We're going to do an iteration of that, but then give you more details about the data set, how to use it, and some and then how to access it. So if you can't stay for the whole presentation, or you know anybody else who was interested but couldn't make it today, make sure that you look for an email from us in the near future with a recording, and then feel free to share it with whoever you think would be interested in it. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Anna to get started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Meredith. And thank you, everyone. I'm going to get this presentation going. Feel free, as I go along, if you have questions, to stick them in the chat. I probably won't do that till the end of the presentation, but we'll try to address them. And we'll also try to make sure we leave time at the end for some open discussion. Also, I will say I'm going to attempt at the end to show you a quick live tech demo of where some of this data is online. So hopefully that'll work out. But the links to all of that will be in the presentation, and we'll send out a copy of the slides to everyone. So after this, you all will have the links to everything that we are talking about today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for you. Okay, and hopefully you all can now see the slideshow. And okay, so here we go. So I'm going to be talking today about this project that's been going on for a couple of years now, working to prioritize climate areas for climate change connectivity in Pennsylvania. And I wanted to start out first by just acknowledging the many collaborators on this. Like I said, this is a large project that's been going on for a while. So a number of folks have really been integral to this work, both at WPC and also at DCNR. So many thanks to them. I'm just the spokesperson today for this group effort. So overall, what I'm going to talk about today is first, I'm going to give you all an intro to the data sets, talk a little bit about why we are focused on climate change connectivity, how we created these data sets, and then I think most of the presentation will really be focused on the use of this data. So how can we access it? What do we think are its best uses? What are some of its limitations? And then I'm going to walk you through sort of a use framework we've developed and some case studies to kind of give you some examples for how this data might ideally fit into different types of workflows and answer some of the questions that I think a lot of you are addressing in your work from day to day. And then I'll finish up, like I said, with sharing some links and showing you all how to get this data, because this is all currently, sorry, I'm just admitting some participants. This is all available for everyone, and we want people to use this data. So with that, so the main goal of this project was, was to identify and prioritize a statewide network of connected areas to facilitate biodiversity movement and adaptation to climate change. So funding for this was provided by DCNR. And like I said, this is a multi-year project. And the way we chose to go about this project was, again, to focus on landscape connectivity. So why landscape connectivity? So basically, landscape connectivity is the ability of plants or animals to move freely through a landscape. So this type of movement is integral for natural processes like dispersal, migration, or gene flow. As we know, populations are not isolated, but need to be connected for all those processes to occur. And there are two types of connectivity. There's one, structural and functional connectivity. So structural connectivity refers to the actual physical relationship between portions of the landscape. So thinking about a riparian corridor is a really good example of a structurally connected habitat, in that there's a continuous path physically. Whereas functional connectivity is a little more specific to the species which are trying to move through the landscape, right? So when we think about functional connectivity, we talk about not just whether the land is actually connected, but whether species are capable of moving through that landscape. So obviously, functional connectivity, you might have a structurally connected landscape, but species' ability to navigate that landscape and their response to various barriers of different shapes and sizes is going to vary based on that species' specific ability to move through the landscape. So I think this is just an important thing to keep in mind, that when we say a landscape is connected, I think a good question is always to ask, is connected for which species, connected for who, right? So to start with this work, we relied heavily, we used the Nature's Network's predefined set of what they call cores and connectors as the base for this project. So Nature's Network is a collaborative effort run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service of a number of partners. And what they did was for all of the Northeast, they set aside approximately 25% of the landscape, which they designated as relatively intact and well-connected wildlife habitat. And they divided that area up into what they call cores. So these are sort of the essential central intact habitat areas, and then connectors, which they defined as the structural corridors, which they said is likely to facilitate wildlife movement from core to core. So one thing that's really important about this is that because this Nature's Network was conducted for the entire Northeast, Pennsylvania is a part of that. So we are, so all the connected aspects of Pennsylvania that are used for this project are also connected further to other cores and connectors in other states. So while we focused on, and for the rest of this presentation, the analyses I'll be talking about are focused specifically on Pennsylvania, we're working with a data set that expands beyond our state's boundary, because as we know, species are not necessarily, don't care about the political boundaries. So we first started, like I said, we started with this base of habitat cores and connectors. And then we developed, this is work mostly done by David Yaney and Chris Tracy. They developed a model in GIS to prioritize those cores and connectors within Pennsylvania. And they used 5 major factors to contribute to this prioritization. Half of the part of prioritization was based on regional flow. And this is data that was also taken from Nature's Network. This is the sort of the permeability of the landscape, the ability for species to actually move through those structural corridors. 20% of prioritization was based on landscape resilience. So this is the this refers to the topographical diversity of a particular area of the landscape. So the idea is that more resilient portions of the landscape are going to have more microtopographical variations and are likely to be more resistant to the impacts of climate change. We also incorporated geophysical settings. That's about 10% of the analysis. And geophysical settings are a combination of elevation, soils, topography. And in Pennsylvania, we have prioritized our geophysical settings based on their biodiversity value and the degree to which they are or are not protected. So higher priority geophysical settings, areas like, for example, limestone habitats or lower elevation areas, which tend to be less protected and also provide critical habitat for more species, were higher prioritized areas of connectivity in the landscape. We included a landscape condition model. So this referred to, it included things like distance from roads and other disturbance factors. And then finally, we included a natural heritage areas data, which allowed us to prioritize areas based on the amount of biodiversity that they were currently supporting, specifically for rare species. So all of these factors went into a GIS model. We started with polygon inputs, which we converted to rasters and scaled. And then I'm not going to walk you through the details of this complex model, just to say that we put everything together. We did a couple of trial and errors, varying the weighting factors. But ultimately, what we came out with was this statewide prioritization of climate change cores and connectors, with darker red areas being higher priority portions of the landscape for connecting for climate change. I also want to showcase to you 3 attributes that we included in this data set that we thought were important, particularly for folks who are going to be using this data. I'm sorry. So we thought about the questions people are asking when they're doing analyses with these data set. One question we thought people might be interested in is addressing is, where can land protection increase climate change connectivity? So we coded sites with a what we call a protection priority. So these are sites that, so any sites that were unprotected and had significant connectivity value, we prioritize them within the data set from no, which means they're already protected, to very high. So these are, so a very high site would be unprotected and currently would have would be a high priority for protection. Another analysis question we addressed was, well, where can management improve connectivity? So we defined these areas as places, protected corridors that had a significant connectivity value. So areas that are already protected, where management might be the way to address preservation of that habitat. So again, we so areas that are ranked from medium to very high, based on how important we think management is for those particular areas. And then finally, we have the question, where can restoration improve connectivity? And here this is just a simple binary yes or no. So areas that were defined as being a restoration priority are corridors with significant connectivity value, but lower landscape conditions. So these are areas where doing work like improving habitat might have a really large impact on improving overall climate change connectivity. So this is the base data set that we created. The next step we took was to convert these cores and connectors to parcel level data. And we thought this was important because much of the work that goes on in the state is done at the level of the parcel, the individual parcel, whereas these cores and connectors tend to be larger and might be less directly relevant to management questions and management issues. So what we did with the help of DCNR was we collected data on approximately 5.9 million parcels in Pennsylvania, and then we subset that down to the approximately 390,000 parcels which actually intersected our corridors. And then we were able to downscale the climate change connectivity corridor attributes to these individual parcels. So we created two versions of the data set. The first was a parcel level, an actual specifically parcel level data set, which we kept internally to DCNR. And the second was what we called a dissolved version of this parcel data set, which we can share publicly. So what that means is that we dissolved the individual parcel boundaries, but we maintained the consistent climate change connectivity attributes. So what that means now is that while the overall outlines of the parcels align with current parcel boundaries, individual parcels that share the same climate change connectivity attributes have been combined in the data set. And I'll show you some examples of that. So to do this work, each parcel score was determined based on the parcel size, the proportion of that parcel which overlapped a core or connector, and then also the connectivity value of the overlapping core or connector. So this is just sort of a cartoon showing you what that downscaling led to. And then we have a pretty straightforward model where we created a connectivity priority score for each parcel, which was a combination of the connectivity area score multiplied by the connectivity area proportion and also the connectivity value. So what that means, what happened then was that the parcel boundaries became the new boundary of our data set, and each parcel that overlapped with a core or connector was given a score. So just to show you what this looks like, here is a screenshot of a section of the data from the original cores and connectors data set. And this is what it looks like when it's been parcelized. So you can see you get a finer scale variation, and the variation aligns with parcel boundaries. And then just to compare for you the original parcel layer on the left versus the dissolved parcel layer, as you can see the attribute levels are the same, but the actual boundaries of the individual polygons have been dissolved in this dissolved parcel layer along the boundaries of the climate change connectivity attributes. This dissolved layer is what we'll be sharing, what is currently publicly available, and what I will share with everyone after the talk. So we're going to now, that's sort of the quick and dirty overview for how we created this data. I'm going to move now into focusing mostly on use of the data. I think when we thought about the best ways to use this data, we thought about from a regional perspective, if you're asking questions about broader scale issues, the cores and connectors data set is a really great place to start. But if your work has a more localized focus, say within a municipality, within a county, then I think the climate change connectivity parcels is likely the most applicable data set for your questions. So for example, this is one large core from the cores and connectors, and then here it is with this more localized focus, parcelized, where you can see again, there's a lot more finer scale variation. There are multiple ways to access this data. I'll show you several of them at the end of this talk, but you can visualize this data set within Pennsylvania Conservation Explorer right now. We're really excited we've got that up and running, so many thanks to Nathan for that with DCNR. And you can also directly download or import this data from WPC's feature service page on ArcGIS Online, which I'll show you as well. And there are links to the feature service available via Conservation Explorer. So basically what this means is you can work with this data online within our platform, and you can also download it directly and work within your own GIS framework on your computer. So moving on to what we think are some of the best uses for this data. Despite the fact that we do have parcel level data, we do still think that relatively broad scale conservation planning questions and uses make the most sense for this data. So when I talk about broad scale, we're saying statewide, regional within the state, or county scale. So a great place for this data to be incorporated, for example, would be into greenway plannings or county action plans. Or additionally, as a first planning step to be supplemented by additional finer scale data sources and surveys. And the reason we're really focused on scale here is because of one of the major limitations of this data set, which is that it was created at a 1 to 24,000 scale. So this is a scale of most USGS quadrangular topographic maps. So you can see this is an example of a 1 to 24,000 scale map. So you can see small roads, larger buildings, and some natural features. But natural variation that occurs at a less than 1 to 24,000 scale is unlikely to be well picked up by this analysis, right? So I think it would be fair and probably appropriate to consider many of the boundaries between parcels as relatively fuzzy in this data set, because some of the variation that might be important to species that were or natural habitats occurs at a scale that is finer than 1 to 24,000. So again, I think this data set is unlikely to represent microtopographic variations or especially boundaries between individual smaller parcels well. So if you have questions or problems that are really at that smaller, finer scale, this data set might be a starting point, but you're really going to want to do a lot more ground truthing to determine whether the boundaries that this data recommends are actually applicable to the questions at hand. So what I want to do now is walk you through a use framework that we put together to sort of help guide folks in how we think this data might fit into a general workflow. And the first step, I think, in all projects is really to identify your project goals. So if these goals are related to climate change connectivity, maybe you're thinking about preserving stepping stone habitats, riparian corridors, expanding core habitat, or improving matrix permeability. And then from that, once a goal is defined, you can select focal parcel corridors. And this can be done based on some of the key attributes of the data that are included. So restoration priority, management, protection priority, or just the overall regional connectivity priority of this data. And then what we recommend is going from that to thinking about assessing the biological function of your area of interest and also the conservation function of your area of interest. So what we mean when we say that, maybe with the biological function, maybe this is a question of selecting biological conservation targets, plant or animal species, for example, or natural communities. Remember, I mentioned right at the beginning, the difference between structural and functional connectivity. So a lot of how you define connectivity for a project is really going to be dependent on the dispersal ability of the species that you're targeting with your work. And similarly, from a conservation function perspective, this is more, again, we're thinking along the lines of whether your goals for this project are about restoration, management, or protection of habitat. And then from there, there's a lot of actions that can be taken to support these goals and these assessments. So from a biological function perspective, maybe field surveys are going to be necessary, desktop data evaluation, so combining this data set with other data sets that are available. From a conservation function perspective, again, there's field assessments that can be done, so really assessing the condition of the parcels of focus, which you're not going to be able to tell, obviously, necessarily from the data and from the desktop. Land use evaluations, so asking questions about how the land is actually being used and whether the conditions that it shows on the desktop actually match what's happening on the ground. And then we also strongly recommend expert and stakeholder interviews. So working with landowners, land managers, biologists, foresters, knowledgeable community members to really figure out what's going on in this area and what types of actions are most appropriate. So this is a lot, obviously, and to kind of bring this all together, what we did was we put together a story map containing 2 case studies. The first is a climate change connectivity study for wetland butterflies. So this is what we consider kind of a species-specific conservation approach. And then we also have a case study that addresses vernal pool stepping stone habitats. This is more of a site level conservation case study. And I'm going to show you a little bit. I'm going to walk you through one of them and hopefully show you a live demo of the second. But these are, again, these are case studies that we built to sort of show the example workflows and how this data may work well with other types of data to address these kind of questions you might have. And so again, just to reiterate, the main goals of this are to, again, have a clear project goal, conduct biological function assessments, and then also conservation function assessments in support of your project goals. So this is what the story map looks like on the landing page. Again, I will show you the links so you can kind of work through this at your own leisure after this if you would like. And I'm going to walk you through now the basics of our first case study, which is really focusing on climate change connectivity, based on a biological conservation target. So the species we chose to focus on for this example is the bog copper, which is a rare wetland butterfly. We chose the species because we've actually done a lot of work on it already, and we already know that this is a species which is likely to suffer from the impacts of climate change. It's restricted to high elevation bog habitats, which we know are also likely to be experiencing a lot of degradation and change as a result of climate change. So on the left here is an example of a previous wetland butterflies project where we modeled this species likely habitat range in the future under climate change, and saw that a lot of the habitat in Pennsylvania is likely to be lost. So this is, again, a species for which planning for the future and planning to build resilience into its habitat is important. So the first step is identifying a focal corridor. So what we did here was we combined the known locations for this bog copper in the state with this climate change connectivity data set. As you can see, in the northeast of Pennsylvania, there's a density of the species occurrences that also overlaps with an area that is of high priority in general for climate change connectivity. So here, zooming in, you can see, again, these are some of the occurrences for the species, and many of them are overlapping with parcels, which are of either high or very high regional climate change connectivity importance. So again, working to conserve this species would also benefit regionally our network of habitats in the state. As we know, the species is a habitat specialist, a bog specialist in particular. We also brought in some data that showed the habitats in the area. So here are 4 peatland habitat types for which a species is associated with. And you can see that the species is mostly occurring in those habitat types, because as I said, it is a specialist. So when we're conducting a biological function assessment for this bog copper, thinking about whether we want to work on protecting, managing, or restoring specialized habitat. For this species, we know that we can connect intact habitat patches in a stepping stone manner because bog coppers are a butterfly and they're capable of crossing barriers to some extent. And in fact, we know from previous research that they can colonize new habitat patches within 2 kilometers of currently known populations. So taking that information into our project, what we did was we created a 2-kilometer buffer around each of the bog copper occurrences. And then we've created a further 2-kilometer buffer around that buffer, which gives us, again, when we're thinking about where we might want to create stepping stone habitats or work on management or restoration, this gives us a really nice way to start to visualize where those areas are that we might want to work in the landscape. If we're going to take a protection focused strategy, here we've taken those sort of double 2-kilometer buffers and identified from the climate change connectivity data set, high priority currently unprotected habitats. So this kind of mapping might suggest to you where you might want to prioritize protection work in this area for the bog copper. If you wanted to take more of a management approach, here we're showing currently protected habitat that's already currently protected and is also high or very high priority. And this might support areas where we know that the habitat is already protected for conservation, and we can instead focus on managing to improve habitat quality. In terms of using that data to support field surveys, we could focus on assessing the quality of habitat patches that are located within stepping stone buffer distances from known bog copper populations. So this is, again, this data can be a really good way to sort of filter out and focus a field survey campaign. And then finally, as we would highly recommend, if you were to take an approach like this, working with stakeholders and experts to facilitate those kind of field surveys. So here's an example of some folks out looking for, I don't think bog coppers, but another butterfly species. Okay, so with that, I want to show you the live story map data. So if you bear with me, hopefully the technology will work. I'm going to stop this screen sharing and open up the actual story map to show you the second case study, just so you can get a sense of how that works. So hold on. Okay, so hopefully switching over, and then you can hopefully now see my story map. So this is the actual story map. It has sort of chapters. So what I'm going to do is move to the second chapter. And this is the chapter that addresses climate change connectivity for high priority conservation corridors. So thinking about this from a site specific approach rather than a species specific approach. So we focused on an area along the Kittatinny Ridge for this section. We already know this is a focal area for conservation work in the state and contains a lot of high priority parcels for climate change connectivity. So the first step here is selecting a focal corridor. We showed that, and thinking about this, there's a lot of different ways to, again, to parse this data set. So on the left-hand panel here, what we're showing are currently protected parcels, which occur primarily along the ridge lines in this area. Whereas pulling over to the right, what you see here are all the unprotected parcels, which are primarily in the valleys. So again, this is a first step to thinking about where we might want to focus efforts in this area. In general, the majority of the higher priority parcels for climate change can occur along these ridge lines, in large part because this is a habitat that is more intact in this region. But we know that, of course, that especially for species which are not able to disperse long distances, having a denser network of intact habitats to allow stepping stone movements is really important. So some of these unprotected habitats probably matter as well. For the next step, thinking about biological function assessment, we show here that the valleys between the protected ridgelines, so here we're only showing the protected parcels, contain streams, and these headwaters are draining out of these ridges.
Hey, Anna.
Yeah.
We have a question I think it would be good to answer now is in the chat. What was your definition for protected parcels?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm trying to think what data set in particular we worked off of. I believe we were working off of the PASDA, the We Conserve PA's data set for protected land. So what I will say is I do not think that we have a very strict definition of protected here. So protected does not necessarily mean restricted from use. So some areas, for example, may be protected, but not necessarily for a conservation specific purpose. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So I think it's a pretty broad definition of protected in this data set. But if whoever has this question, I can get back to you with more specific information, and we have some metadata that can support that. Okay, so going back to this, so let's see. So here what we decided to do was we pulled in some vernal pool data that we had from our pool observation network database, which is a Pennsylvania vernal pool registry. And we showed some areas that contain vernal pools currently, which is in the light blue here. And what you can do then is you can combine that data with many of the unprotected parcels, which you can see overlap many of those vernal pools. So a protection strategy that focused on maintaining floodplain connectivity and also protecting upland nearby forest might make sense in this area, for example. From a conservation function perspective, again, most of this area is not protected currently, but some of the high priority protected areas within Buchanan State Forest, efforts might be taken to improve management for these species and improve water quality, leading into the vernal pools. So now here we're visualizing parcels in the area which are a priority for restoration. So again, if what your question is more about thinking about protected properties or parcels that might need additional management to improve habitat quality, this would be a good way to kind of pick out on the landscape which ones those are. Or again, managing already protected high priority parcels is another approach that we taken in this case. So again, this is just showing you sort of how this story map looks and works out. It's interactive. We highly recommend that you take a look at this after the talk. Then the other thing I want to show you while I'm already in online is I want to show you where this data can actually be found. So the first place that I recommend you going is Conservation Explorer. This is on the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program's website. And you'll see on the left that we now have an option to add this climate change connectivity data set to the map, so you can visualize this data. We're working through a little bit of technical issues with getting the data to load at this broader scale. You can see it's sort of loading now, but it is there. And when you zoom in, you should be able to see it much better. And generally, you'd be working at it at a more zoomed in scale anyway. So I'll just give it a moment to load, but while it's loading, what I want to point out is if you go over to the menu and click on this button, you can view details and view descriptions. So clicking on any of those gives you kind of a quick overview and also a link to another story map that I'm not showing today that provides a little more information on the initial core analyses that were done for this project. And also for those of you who want to actually download and import this data under view details, this will actually take you, as you can see, to the feature service landing page. And the URL for that can be used to import this data directly into, say, an ArcGIS desktop product, so that you can actually manipulate the data and work with it yourself. There are links in the PowerPoint, which I will share out to everyone, which also sends you to the ArcGIS Online landing pages for all this data. So here is the landing page for the chords and connectors, which again also is a feature service page. It gives you a little summary of the project. And then if you zoom down, here's the URL that will again allow you to download this data and work with it yourself. And similarly, we have the same setup landing page for not the parcel. Here is the public parcels data. So this is all again accessible. You can take it right after. You can go to it right after this talk and use it however you want. We highly encourage that. There's citation credits. So if you have any publications or products with it, we'd love it if you cited the data, but otherwise we really want people to use this. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop now the formal part of this presentation, but I see we have a lot of questions in the chat. So maybe we can open this up to some conversation. Thank you all for joining us.
Most of the chat things are links that I provided as you were talking.
Oh, great.
Yeah, we thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for such a great presentation of this information. And yes, we do want to open up to any questions.
Yeah, so feel free to either pop it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and just ask directly if you'd like. Okay, we already addressed the question about our definition of protected parcels.
I don't know if you had anything to add to the first question about the difference between management and restoration.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. So I think the main distinction for us between management and restoration had to do with the protection status of the site, but also for the for parcels which we defined as being of a restoration priority. These were ones for which the landscape condition score was low relative to other parcels in the data sets. I didn't go too much into detail about what our landscape condition data set was that we used to define this, but it's basically a distance decay function away from human development and roadways and such. So parcels that were, for example, I think a parcel that it's a high restoration priority would be one that was integral for climate change connectivity, but might be, for example, close to a major roadway or near an urban area, for example. So might need more habitat improvement work than a management site, which might be more about sustaining the current state.
Great.
Yeah, hopefully that.
And as people are thinking of questions, I also think this is a good opportunity to, if anyone can think of a way that your organization or agency might be able to use this data. We'd love to hear how you might use it, and if you have any questions about accessing it.
Yeah. I think, Patricia, you had a question. You raised your hand.
Yeah, that was a great tie-in, because that was related to a question, and also maybe an invitation that I had for you, which was that this amazing data set seems to be more focused on where to do protection and restoration and management. And so I was wondering, once you wanted to take that next leap into doing that management or restoration or climate change adaptation, were there any particular folks that you worked with? Were there any tools that you use to incorporate adaptation into management planning? And kind of as an invitation, we have a adaptation workbook that's specifically designed to help land managers do that. And so I would be looking for any opportunities to work with the folks who are doing the on the ground management, and trying to marry all of these tools together to figure out where to do the best protection and management, and then how to do that climate adapted management.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's such a key thing to highlight, that this data set really is trying to help us with the where, but the resources that you talk about, the toolkits you've developed, are really more about the what, right? So I think every project that uses this data set is going to have to answer both those questions, right? And I think there's going to be different types of resources that they'll need for those two different types of questions.
Awesome. Well, I hope I can talk to you more offline and look for some ways to intersect.
Yeah, because I think when we created this data set, we didn't think of it as a standalone data product. We very much thought about it as something that could be part of a toolkit, a climate change toolkit for Pennsylvania and for Pennsylvanians to use in combination with other available resources.
Yeah, thank you for your comment, Patricia. I'm glad you could join us today. I want to make sure anyone else can speak up if you wanted to follow up on that discussion. I do have a couple of examples of how DCNR is using the data, but I would like to give other people a chance to speak up first. Okay, well, I'll just say that some of you may have already been in the talk that we gave at We Can Serve PA, and so you might be aware of this already, but one way that DCNR is using this data set is that we've our planning staff in the Bureau of Forestry has integrated it into a mapping kind of tool that they use called the prospects analysis tool. And what it is a way for us to rank the different acquisitions that we might be considering on a large landscape scale. And we already have lots of other attributes that we look at in order to decide what parcel might be the most important for us to acquire or to protect. And now we've integrated this layer into that as part of that ranking process, so that we can make sure that we know if an area that we're looking at for acquisition is also highly connected for on the landscape. So that's just one example of how we're already using it, and hopefully others might be able to use it in a similar way in your protection ranking. And it looks like we have a comment in the chat from Jeannie Ortiz saying that she, my hope is we can integrate it into the Kittatinny Ridge Conservation Landscape Conservation Plan. So that would be excellent. Yeah, we know that a lot of people on this call are already looking at climate change, connectivity in Pennsylvania. And you know, the Kittatinny Ridge is a great example of that. And we hope that this data can be used by those groups. And really, we just wanted a way to get everybody, you know, looking at this all at once so that we can all know, you know, that it's out there and work together to our different agencies and organizations that are all interested in the same thing, to know this exists and to work together on it. So it looks like Jeannie is saying the timing is good because they're doing the plan now. So that's great to hear. Anyone else already working on a plan like that, or were you looking for this kind of data, or maybe using different kinds of data, or a different source of this kind of connectivity data that you'd want to share? You can use the chat or speak up, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, everyone's too polite. Just go for it. I see Katie.
Thanks. Yeah, I am being super polite today. I am with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, and we are working on a statewide priority conservation analysis, and we are modeling a methodology out of Maine that was used to prioritize conservation along the Appalachian Trail corridor. And we were actually looking for options, various options to reflect connectivity in the broader corridor, like the large landscape around the trail. So we'll be taking a look at this, and we might be able to integrate this into the ATC's statewide conservation priority mapping that's underway, which will also hopefully be reflected in Jeannie's work along the Kittatinny, because much of that is one and the same. So, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And I think yeah, just to reiterate, because the cores and connectors that we base this analysis for in Pennsylvania are ones that connect outside of the states. So especially thinking from the, like, for example, from the Appalachian Trail perspective, the idea is that whatever work is done in Pennsylvania should connect well with work outside of our state boundaries as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. That's great to hear.
Yeah, I see a question in the chat from Paul DCNR. He's asking, in the Conservation Explorer tool, can the climate connectivity layer be moved to the back so it can better point out the gap areas between existing protected parcels? That's a great question, Paul. I don't know off the top of my head the ability to which within that particular mapping platform you can move layers around. But I do know that if you import that feature service into your own mapping platform, you should be able to push it to the background so that you can highlight protected priority or parcels on top of the connectivity layer. I'm also happy to talk with folks about just sort of filtering that can be done with this data set. A lot, like in the story map, a lot of what the selecting out of parcels that I did was based on just filtering that initial data set based on the attributes that are included in it. So there's a way you can within the data set just filter out to show currently protected parcels, for example.
Yeah, and just to follow up a little on the Conservation Explorer question from Paul, I think that Anna's right that it would be better to kind of use it in your own probably ArcGIS map, or just bring the data set into your own platform rather than trying to really analyze it much in the Conservation Explorer tool. We don't have a lot of control over how things are laid out or viewed on the Explorer tool at DCNR, unfortunately. So it has a lot of limitations on just you know, the symbology or just the order of looking at things and things. But we are still working on trying to make it a little more easily viewable. So I can talk to the people who are working on that and see if it's something we can do. But it will definitely be easier to manipulate the data if you just bring it into your own ArcMap or ArcGIS Online map.
Yeah, I would just second that for Conservation Explorer is good for visualization, but for analysis, I would recommend pulling the data set into a different tool, different platform.
And I think Anna said it before, but we are planning on adding a link to the downloadable data set in Conservation Explorer in that view description part of the table of contents that she showed. So it'll have the story map link, and then it'll have beneath that a link to the place where you can download the data if you are looking for that at some point.
Yeah, but we also plan that we'll follow up with the attendees here in this meeting and send you all a copy of the slides that have the links to everything. And you can also, I stuck my email in the chat. If you want to just email me directly, I can also send you any of that kind of information. So yeah, so unless there are any more questions, I think we can probably wrap this up. Oh, okay, here, I see one more question, great. Okay, so building top-down models and this type of stuff is relatively easy using generalized data, but how do we begin building bottom-up operational models that actually demonstrate the utility of restored or quality habitat? Yeah, at the landscape or multi-landscape level. I think that's such a great question. And I think again, I'm really glad you're asking this, because I think it highlights what this data is going to be good for and what it's not going to be good for. Which is that, yeah, this data set is defining sort of like structurally more connected areas of the landscape, but it's not telling us whether the species for which we want to be using that habitat are actually capable of using that. So as to whether modeling can really get at that question, I think it's going to have to be very much a species specific, project specific approach. And that's, I think, just a challenge across ecology in general right now. But yeah, I think again, especially for folks who are working on connectivity for a particular species, this data may be a good place to start, but there's going to have to be some additional modeling done and measurement, field-based measurements taken to really determine whether the connectivity that we see in the map is really actually there for the species.
And I'll follow up on that, on Roy's question there too, that I think that I've been thinking about this too in a way of, I think monitoring is one way to get at that. I think this is sort of what you're answering your question a little bit, but I think that this, in a perfect world, this data set could be used to even kind of determine the corridors in which you might want to focus some monitoring work, or looking at how species are responding and if they are migrating, and if they, you know, kind of like just looking on the ground at what's really happening. And unfortunately, that just takes a long time. You have to start now and monitor for a long time to see if that's actually happening. But at least this gives us an idea of where do you even look for changes. To me, I think this is a good data set to give you an idea of that. And that would be a way that I would go kind of from the bottom up.
And then I see one more quick question here about aligning and integrating this data with PGC's conservation area opportunity tool, which has species data. And yeah, I think for us that's really a big next step for this project, is starting to work through how this new data can really fit in with a lot of these other really great data tools that we already have, and how we can kind of put together projects that incorporate both. So I don't have a direct answer for you now, but I think this is definitely something that's on our minds about how to bring in these other tools with this. Okay, well, in that case, I'm going to end the recording. Thank you all for joining us. Feel free to email me if you have other questions, and you should be hearing from me shortly with the recording information and also just a copy of the PowerPoint. But yeah, please follow up with us, especially if you have project-specific questions or are interested in just how you can best use this data. We're really happy to talk to anyone about this data set and facilitate its use. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for everyone for joining us. And like Anna said, feel free to reach out to either of us.